so many people are visiting somewhere this weekend, as we've just come through a holiday in this nation, a Thanksgiving holiday this past Thursday. Now, I would assume most of you have noticed the same thing I have, and that is the fact that it seems every year Thanksgiving is getting squeezed out a little more and a little more. I noticed a number of places started putting up Christmas decorations as soon as Halloween was over. I used to wait until after Thanksgiving. Now, they're sort of forgetting about Thanksgiving. I think there are a couple of reasons Thanksgiving gets left out of the shuffle. One is the fact that there's not nearly as much money to be made in Thanksgiving as there is in either Halloween or Christmas, say. So unless you're a turkey farmer or sell cranberries or something, there's not just big bucks in Thanksgiving. So I think that's one factor that it sort of gets lost in the shuffle. And I think a second factor is that we are increasingly a thankless nation. People are not particularly thankful. They're not really focused on God and on the fact that He is the author of all these good things, and we're not a particularly thankful nation. In fact, a lot of times in the ads in the newspaper and things that do pertain to Thanksgiving, you'll see it abbreviated, it'll say Happy Turkey Day. And that's really sort of the mindset that a lot of people have, but that's what it's all about. It's a day for maybe a big meal, day for a football game, day to go hunting, day for something, but the concept of really expressing thanks and appreciation to God is a different matter. And that's something that I think we certainly ought to think about in the context that, as Mr. Meredith was talking about in the film that we saw, one of the television programs, that God has made man different and unique from the animals. And one of the things, one of the aspects of that difference is the fact that human beings are able to think, to formulate ideas and thoughts, and to express those ideas and thoughts. God has given us a mouth. He's given us a tongue, and we have the ability to express what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what's on our mind. It's interesting in this regard. If you look over at the book of Isaiah chapter 6, the prophet Isaiah had a remarkable vision that is described here in Isaiah chapter 6. He says in Isaiah 6 verse 1, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and His train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 He covered His face, and 2 He covered His feet, and with 2 He did fly. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Eternal of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory. And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke." This awesome vision that Isaiah saw of the very throne of God settled down there in the temple. And when the voice, when his voice uttered, the very pillars and supports of the temple shook and quaked. The glory of God filled the whole area. It was an absolutely overwhelming sight. And when Isaiah saw it, verse 5, he said, "Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone. Because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphim unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken from the tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth and said, Lo, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is purged. I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me." Isaiah was ready to respond to God, but notice what entered his mind when he saw this vision and he saw the glory and the awesomeness of God. He was absolutely overwhelmed with the grandeur. And the first thing that he said, Woe is me. I'm in trouble now. I am so totally unworthy to be standing in the presence of God. He said, "Woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips." Now, what did Isaiah mean by that? You remember back in the New Testament, when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees and talking to the disciples about the Pharisees, and what had started this whole thing was the Pharisees were upset because Jesus did not follow their ritual washings, the Pharisaic rituals concerning the washing of hands. And they had accused him of eating with defiled hands. And Jesus said, "Look, it's not what you put in your mouth that defiles a person." See, the concept of the Pharisees, the reason they washed their hands, it wasn't that Christ was objecting to sanitation, but they had this big elaborate ritual, and their primary purpose behind it was the idea that they were somehow, they were surrounded by people who weren't nearly as holy as they were, and that inadvertently their hand may have brushed against either something this other person had touched or that person's robe or something walking down the street, and therefore they had been defiled because this other person may have been ceremonially unclean. And so they had touched something this person had touched, had done something, so they needed to be make sure that if they were defiled by touching this person and they picked up some food and put it in their mouth, and somehow that would defile them. So they had this big elaborate ritual. And Christ didn't do that. And he said, "Don't you know?" He said, "It's not what you put in your mouth that defiles you. It's what comes out of your mouth that defiles you." He said, because, you see, it's what's in the heart. In the heart, in the mind, in the inner part of you. There's all sorts of wrong thoughts and attitudes. And he says these things come out. These attitudes in the heart, these unclean thoughts and attitudes express themselves out of the mouth, and that's what defiles a person. It's what comes from the inside out. All of the wrong things. So Christ went through and he taught something about that. Now here Isaiah recognizes that he says, "I'm a man of unclean lips." Why was he a man of unclean lips? Because he said, in effect, I'm a man with an unclean heart. I've got things inside of me that defile me. And what's on the inside ultimately comes out my mouth. I live in a nation that is defiled. I am unworthy to stand in the presence of the holy God. Now it's interesting what was done. In the vision, the angel came and took a live coal, from the altar, and came and touched it to his lips. Now, what was the significance of the coals of the altar? Well, if you remember correctly, there were two altars. One was the big altar, the altar of sacrifice, which was in the courtyard of the temple. And this is where all of the sacrifices were burned. There was another altar, a small altar, something not much bigger than this lectern right here. It was located inside the temple, in the holy place, right in front of the curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. The priests, every morning and every evening, when they offered the sacrifice on the big altar of sacrifice, they took tongs and they took live coals from the firebox down underneath the altar after the sacrifice was offered. They took tongs and they took live coals and they filled what was called the golden censer. It was like a little pan that had a handle where they had a way of carrying it without burning themselves. And they filled it with live coals from the altar of sacrifice. They took that little pan of live coals then into the building, into the temple, and they poured them out right there on top of the altar of incense. And the incense that had been beaten up and ground fine was then sprinkled on top of these live coals. Well, very quickly, of course, smoke began to come up and fill the inner part of the temple with the smoke and the odor of the incense. And the idea was, of course, that a significant part of this drifted back behind the curtain and into the Holy of Holies, into what was symbolic of the very throne of God. Now, the Jews had come to understand what is brought out in the book of Revelation, and that is that the incense was symbolic of the prayers of the saints. And so, every morning and every evening, in fact, you read in the book of Acts, it talks about the disciples there in the temple, and it was the hour of prayer. Well, what was called the hour of prayer was right after the morning sacrifice was offered, when then the coals were taken and put on the incense altar and the incense was burned. And they understood that that incense wafting into the Holy of Holies was symbolic of the prayers of God's people. And so that became a customary time that many religious Jews, if they were able to do so at that point, because it was offered at the same time every morning, that they would make a point of either being in the temple or else wherever they were, and stopping to pray at that point, because that was the time when what was being symbolically carried out in the temple represented the prayers of God's people. You know, we're told, and we'll notice it a little later, that prayer is compared to the sacrifice of our lips. In other words, the symbolism in the temple was first Christ offered himself as a sacrifice to make possible our access to God. That was the altar of burnt offering. And then it is through Christ and his sacrifice that we have direct access, and that's where then the coals from the altar where the sacrifice was offered were taken into the temple. The incense was burned, and that went back into the Holy of Holies. Now, in Isaiah's vision, he saw live coal taken from the altar of sacrifice, something that was normally used to ignite the incense, to, in that sense, purify what was offered up before God, this incense, the prayers of the saints. And in his dream, in his vision, his lips were touched by that live coal from the altar. And so now his lips were no longer unclean, and what came forth from them was to be a sacrifice acceptable to God. Isaiah was deeply conscious of the fact of how important it was what came out of his mouth, and even more so, what came out of his heart, because what comes out of your mouth originates deeper inside of you. It doesn't originate just at the back of the tongue or with the teeth or the tonsils. What comes out of your mouth originates inside of you, in the innermost heart of each of us. Now, in Psalm chapter 50, Psalm 50, verse 14, it says, "Offer unto God thanksgiving, and pay your vows unto the Most High, and call upon me in the day of trouble, and I'll deliver you, and you shall glorify me." We are to offer unto God thanksgiving. We're to be a thankful, appreciative individual. Why does God tell us to offer to Him thanksgiving? Are we doing this for God's benefit? Are we offering thanksgiving to God to sort of make Him feel better about Himself? Or what do we do that for? We offer thanksgiving to God not for God's benefit, but for our benefit. Because when we offer thanksgiving to God, we are being reminded and focused on the fact that everything we have of value originates with God. That God is the giver. And we're focusing on who the source of all of our blessings and benefits actually is. Coming on back here, let's notice a few other Psalms. Psalm 35, verse 18. I will give thanks in the great congregation. I will praise you among much people. You see, thanksgiving is not just something you think inside or that you feel inside. It is something to be expressed. Thanksgiving here is directed toward God, and it's something that we are to express. Something that is to come forth out of our lips. Notice in Psalm 107. Psalm 107 verse 1, "Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for He is good, for His mercy endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom He's redeemed from the hand of the enemy." Not only are we to think it, or we to know it, but we're to say so. Give thanks to the Lord, for He's good. His mercy endures forever. That's a reason to give thanks. Comes on down and continues to talk about various things that God has done. And it says in verse 15, "Oh, that men would praise the Eternal for His goodness and for His wonderful works to the children of men." Coming on down a little further in verse 21, "Oh, that men would praise the Eternal for His goodness, for His wonderful works to the children of men. Let them sacrifice the sacrifices of thanksgiving and declare His works with rejoicing." You come on down a little bit further in verse 31, "Oh, that men would praise the Eternal for His goodness, for His wonderful works to the children of men. Let them exalt Him also in the congregation of the people, and praise Him in the assembly of the elders." Over and over, this refrain, "Oh, that men would praise their God." That they would praise Him for His goodness and for His wonderful works. Now, who benefits from that? Well, you and I primarily benefit when we praise and thank God. People can go through life, some people go through life and everything's negative. And they're always thinking of all their problems and all their troubles, and this went wrong and that went wrong, something else went wrong. I don't know how many of you have seen advertised the little interview with Dan Rather on television of a man by the name of Edgar Rivera in New York. This has been advertised and noted. We had a little announcement on it up in the bulletin board in Dallas. One of the things that's significant about Mr. Rivera is the theme on it has to do with an people were impressed with his attitude. He was back a number of months ago, had someone come up behind him. He was standing there at a subway station in New York, and somebody came up behind him and pushed him, and pushed him down. He fell down into the area where the train was coming, and it ran over him and cut off his legs. He lost the entirety of both legs. Now, that's a horrible thing. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, that ties in with us is a short while before that, Mr. Rivera had been watching the television program and had written in for a visit. He was a prospective member, had just gotten interested, just beginning to learn the truth, and he has this terrible accident. Now, one of the things that was impressive, there are all sorts of things that happen every day in New York City. There are people being shot. There are terrible things that are happening. The thing that attracted the attention of CBS and some of these others was the attitude that this man exemplified and just his approach in going forward. And they just were amazed that somebody could go through something like this and have this sort of a positive attitude. Now, you think about it, and that's a horrible sort of thing. I mean, I don't think most of us can even fully understand what it would be like to go through something that terrible, that just changes your entire life. What is the approach? How do we go forward in our life? Because we all have problems, whether it's that particular problem or other things, and we face different things in the course of our life. Some people go through life and they have a victim mentality. Everything that's happening to them, oh, woe is me. And it's always negative, and they're looking at this problem and that problem and this other problem. And there are other people that go through life and they've got the same kind of problems. But somehow their outlook is different, their perspective is different, and the difference is between those who count their troubles and those who count their blessings. It's really a pretty simple thing. Oh, that men would praise their God for all of His goodness and all of the things that He's done, all the wonders that He's done. You see, if we would praise God for the goodness that He gives us, for all of His goodness and for all of the works, the wondrous works, it would set our mind in a positive approach. We would be the ones who would benefit from that. We would then be bringing forth the sacrifice of thanksgiving from our lips. We would be using our mouths and our lips to express the things that are good, that are helpful, and it would affect not only our focus and our mind, but it would also positively influence all of the people that we had connections with. Because, you see, we all interact with various people, and what we say has its influence. Now let's go on a little bit further. One a very familiar verse back in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 18, right along this same line where the Apostle Paul says, "In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you." In everything give thanks. Find something positive. Be appreciative and expressive of that appreciation to God. We I think everybody's heard at one time or another the little short poem about two men who looked through prison bars. One saw mud and one saw stars. They were looking out the same window, just a matter of which direction their eyes were focused. You see, you can be in an awfully dismal place, but if you're looking up, you can be in the dankest dungeon there is, but if you've got a window where you can look up, you can see what God has done. And you can see the stars, the handiwork of God. Of course, on the other hand, if you're looking down and all you see is the muck and mire and mud that is the result of what man has done, it can give you a totally different perspective on life. You're standing at the same window. And you see, we all go through life and we can stand at the same window, but it's where are we looking? Where are our eyes set? And that's why Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:18, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ concerning you. This is what God wants us to do, is to have this thankful, appreciative attitude and this expression of being thankful and appreciative. Back in Psalm 116, Psalm 116, verse 17. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and will call upon the name of the Lord. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving. You see, the words that come forth of our lips, our prayers, our expression of thanksgiving to God is compared to a sacrifice. It is, we're offering the sacrifice of our lips. Psalm 100 verse 4 is very familiar. In fact, Psalm 100 is, of course, a very familiar psalm. It starts out, make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all you lands. Down in verse 4 it says, enter into His gates with thanksgiving, and into His courts with praise. Be thankful unto Him and bless His name. We're to come before God with thanksgiving, to come with praise, to be thankful, to bless His name. It's interesting. What we say is vitally important. 2 out of the 10 commandments very directly deal with what comes out of our mouth. The commandment says, don't take God's name in vain. That directly deals with what you say. Another commandment says, don't bear false witness. That directly deals with what you say. Now, I understand by principle and implication, various of the other commandments have to do with what we say as well. Honoring your parents would certainly include the things that you say to them and about them. Various other things that could involve what we say when you get into understanding the spirit of the law. But just in the most direct sense, that 2 of the commandments very directly deal with the words that come out of your mouth. Now, that shows God places a lot of emphasis on what we say. And he talks about the importance of praising Him, of being thankful to Him, because that provides a mindset and an approach. It's a key to peace of mind. The Apostle Paul says in the book of Philippians, I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Paul had learned the secret of inner peace. Now, we read that, and people read it and say, well, yeah, maybe Paul felt that way, but he didn't have my trouble. Well, he probably had some worse. I don't think when you go through and you read the story of what Paul went through in his life, I don't know of any of us that want to trade problems with Paul. When he wrote those words in the book of Philippians, he was in a jail in Rome. I don't think they had a lot of prison rights movements back in first century Roman Empire. I don't think Emperor Nero would have put up with a whole lot of that. He'd probably thrown them in jail too. Prisons today aren't a place that I know anybody that really wants to spend much time. Over the years, I have visited a lot of people in prison, and I was always glad to get out. Just had a feeling of relief when the last door clanged shut behind me on my way out. When the doors were clanging shut behind me on my way in, this thought sort of goes through your mind. You think, I'm back in here, and if they don't let me out, I'm stuck. This isn't a place that I want to be. Now, prisons today aren't places that people really enjoy spending time, but I'd be willing to bet that the prisons we have today are a whole lot better than the prisons that Paul spent time in almost 2,000 years ago. As bad as they are today, they've improved. But Paul was in one of those places. When he wrote the book of Philippians, he was in prison. He was chained up. And he said, I've learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Paul was not sitting there just all frustrated and just tearing his hair out. And he explains that secret in the book of Philippians. He said, be careful for nothing. That's the way it's rendered in the King James. Be careful for nothing. In other words, don't be filled with care and anxiety about anything. But in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. See, there is a result. Peace is a result of something. Don't worry about it, pray about it. Prayer, supplication, with thanksgiving. And the peace of God. It's a peace that originates from the above, not just from the around. Most people can have some degree of peace if they get in a peaceful enough environment. Beautiful day today, and if you're out in maybe a pleasant little park, or you're out somewhere and the birds are singing and the sky is blue and you're comfortable and everything is going fine. Well, most people can have some degree of peace. But the real key to inner peace is the peace of God, the peace that originates with God. And we're told that expressing thanksgiving to God is a key. It is part of what tunes our mind in and makes us receptive to that inner peace that originates with God. Now, thankfulness is first and foremost something to be expressed to God, but it's also appropriate to express thankfulness and appreciation to people. One of the outstanding examples of that we can notice back in 2 Samuel chapter 2. In 2 Samuel chapter 2, you have the story. King Saul had been killed, or had died, as a result of this battle with the Philistines. And the Philistines had taken his dead body from the battlefield and had sought to desecrate it, to sort of make a public spectacle and to deny any sort of honor or respect to Saul and his death. So they had taken his dead body and they had impaled it up for everybody to look at and just had made, a spectacle in that way. sort of similar. Any of you who remember back to World War II, that's what the Italian partisans did with the body of Mussolini at the end of the war. You know, they not only wanted to kill him, but they wanted to hang his body up for everybody to gawk at and to express their hatred and their contempt for him. Well, this is what the Philistines had done with the body of King Saul. And the account in 2 Samuel chapter 2 is the story of the men of a little village, a little place called Jabesh Gilead. Now, you know, Saul was a lot of things in life, and he wasn't a very good king. But in the early days of Saul's reign, one of the few things that he did that really was outstanding was he came to the rescue of this little village of Jabesh Gilead, which was threatened with, a terrible, they were in a terrible plight, and Saul came to their rescue. And the people of Jabesh Gilead never forgot it. And years went by, and Saul deteriorated, and he was a lot of things. But the people in Jabesh Gilead never forgot that in their greatest hour of need, Saul had come to help them. And so the men of this little village, when they heard of what had happened in Saul's death and the fact that his dead body was impaled up here for the Philistines to mock and ridicule, they got together and they made a raid at night. They came down there and just quickly came in, sort of a commando-style raid, grabbed the body, and took off. And the night, of course, provided cover for them. And they brought it back, and they gave him a decent, respectful burial. King David, who was the newly crowned king, heard about this. And he wrote a letter to the men of Jabesh Gilead, and he expressed there his deep respect and appreciation to them for the kind of respect and appreciation that they had had towards Saul. Now, you might just notice here in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, verse 5, David sent messengers unto the men of Jabesh Gilead. And he said unto them, Blessed be you of the Eternal, that you have showed this kindness unto your Lord, even unto Saul, and have buried him. And now the Lord show kindness and truth unto you. And I also will requite you this kindness, because you have done this thing. You know, an expression of appreciation, David valued loyalty. He valued people who were appreciative, who were thankful, who had a certain memory. And so here these people had a respect that they demonstrated even after the death of Saul. He was no longer around to reward them. A lot of people in David's place would have been resentful and would have thought, well, boy, you know, those guys, they like Saul. I'm the new king. You know, they ought to forget about him and like me. But that was not David's attitude at all. You see, it's appropriate and proper that we express appreciation, show and demonstrate respect. David thanked these people. He expressed his appreciation to them because of their attitude and their loyalty, their appreciation of what Saul had done for them many years earlier. There are many other examples that we could go through. Let's just notice one in the New Testament. We'll notice one back in Romans 16. Paul is writing to the church at Rome, and he's sending this letter with some people. And in Romans 16:1, he says, I commend unto you Phoebe, our sister, which is a servant, and this word servant is the Greek word for deaconess, which is a deaconess of the church that is at Cenchrea. Cenchrea was a sort of the port. It was a suburb and port for the city of Corinth. So he says, I commend to you her, that you receive her in the Lord as become saints, that you assist her in whatever business she has need of you. For she has been a succorer of many, a helper of many, and of myself also. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my helpers in Christ Jesus, who have for my life laid down their own necks, unto whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles. So he singles these people out that are bringing this letter, And he says, I want you people to get to know Phoebe and Aquila and Priscilla. Get to know them and appreciate them, value them. Express that appreciation because they are people who have helped and served many, many people. Well, it's appropriate not only to express thanks to God. I mean, that's first and foremost. Thanks and appreciation ought to be expressed to God. But thanks and appreciation can and should be expressed to other people. Notice in the book of James, chapter 3. You know, all of us are convinced of that. We all believe that we ought to be thankful, we ought to be appreciative, we ought to be thankful to God. But notice what James says as he's writing here to the church, to brethren. My brethren, he addresses in chapter 3, verse 1. And notice he says in verse 9, we'll pick it up, James 3:9. Speaking of the tongue, he says, therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a fountain send forth same place, sweet water and bitter? Can the fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries? Either a vine, figs, so can no fountain both yield salt water and fresh. Now he says, you know, a fountain brings forth the same thing. It's either good water or it's bad water. It's poison or it's fresh. But he said, out of the mouth, we say things that are good and we say things that are bad. That shouldn't be. Praise God and curse men. Human beings made in the image of God, and yet we will say those things. Verse 13, who's a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conduct his works with meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descends not from above, but it's earthly, sensual, devilish. Where envying and strife is, there's confusion and every evil work. The wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, without hypocrisy. The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. So James makes quite a contrast in terms of what is coming out of our mouth. But notice verse 14. What's coming out of our mouth? Why is there a problem with what's coming out of our mouth? Verse 14, bitter envying and strife in the heart. Ultimately, what's coming out of our mouth is a reflection of what's on the inside. It's out of the heart. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So when envying and strife is in the heart, then the things that come out of the mouth are things that are not beneficial, not constructive, not helpful. Those things can be very detrimental. And there's great contrast that's drawn. You know, Christ laid a very important emphasis on what is said and the importance of what is said back in Matthew chapter 12. This was sort of the analogy or the illustration that James was drawing on there in James 3. Notice, Jesus said in Matthew 12:33, either make the tree good and his fruit good, or else make the tree corrupt and the fruit corrupt. For a tree is known by his fruit. Now James was talking about that. You know, you don't gather olives from a vine, from a grapevine. You don't gather grapes from a fig tree. You expect to get that what the tree produces, the fruit the tree yields, is indicative of what kind of tree it is. The tree is known by its fruit. That's the way you identify it. So Christ said, make the tree good or make the tree bad. You know, the tree and the fruit need to go together. And then verse 34, O generation of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things. An evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. But I say unto you that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. For by your words you shall be justified, and by your words you shall be condemned. What we say is vitally important, and we'll be held accountable for what we say. And ultimately the key, he says right here, has to do with a change of heart. Because we bring forth a treasure out of our heart. And so it's a matter of whether it is a good treasure or an evil treasure. Because it's out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. All of these things come down. Let's notice back a little further in the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul talking here and addressing some of this sort of thing. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 1, he says, Be you therefore followers of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and has given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor. Fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not be once named among you as become saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather the giving of thanks. Now, this term, foolish talking, it's one word in the Greek, morologia. Moro is the word in the Greek, means fool. Our English word moron is derived from that Greek term. Logo, or would be the word, logos. So it's foolish words. Just foolish, silly things that have no value to anything. The term jesting would better be rendered filthy jesting. Because really what it means, as you look up the word, is it refers to somebody who's quick-witted, but in the sense of something that's vulgar, something that's off-color, somebody who's always, it may be funny, may be clever what they say, but it's got some vulgar, rotten connotation. And so he says, look, don't be spending your time. Be followers of God as dear children. Walk in love. There are things that shouldn't be once named among you. And all this foolish silliness and filthy, vulgar jokes and that sort of thing, that's not what ought to characterize your speech, but rather the giving of thanks. What comes out of our mouth is important. Christ said it was. A lot of times over the years, people have developed habits and patterns of the way they use their tongue. People can use the tongue as a weapon. A lot of times in a family growing up, maybe the little brother develops a sharp tongue. I mean, after all, a big brother's got his weapons. He can pound away. So little brother's got to retaliate, and since he can't match him blow for blow, well, maybe he develops a sharp tongue and just an ability to just cut to the quick, to say some smart, quick comeback, a way to hurt, a way to get even. Well, we develop patterns, and some of the patterns we develop aren't good. We've all heard the little childhood ditty that was recited in the playground. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Of course, that's not true. Generally, when people said that was when the words had hurt them. Somebody had said something and it cut, it hurt, they felt put down. And so they come back with that as if to say, well, it doesn't bother me, I don't care what you say. Which if they hadn't cared what the other person said, they probably wouldn't have bothered to say anything at all. Words can carry a tremendous impact. A tremendous impact for good, a tremendous impact for bad. Interesting as you look through, the opposite of putting someone down is to build someone up. The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 14, Romans 14 and verse 19, he said, "Let us therefore follow after the things which make for peace, and things wherewith one may edify another," the things that someone may use to build up someone else, to build up and to encourage others. Now let's follow after the things that make for peace, the things that can build up and encourage others. There's a man in the New Testament that is one of the familiar characters to anyone who's read the book of Acts and Paul's epistles. His name is Barnabas, and he, of course, was one of the early leaders in the New Testament church. He traveled many places and preached sermons and was a companion of the Apostle Paul for a period of time. And most of us are familiar with the name Barnabas. Did you realize Barnabas was not his name? Barnabas was just a nickname. His name was Joseph the Levite. He's mentioned, first time he's mentioned back in the book of Acts, his real name is given. His name was Joseph the Levite. He was from the island of Cyprus. He owned property in the Jerusalem area, and the first place we find it mentioned there is he had sold his property and donated the money to the church. And we're told there that the apostles gave him a nickname. And the nickname stuck. And he went through the rest of his life and the rest of the book of Acts. He's never called by his real name. Nobody ever called him Joseph anymore. He was always known by his nickname. His nickname was Barnabas. Now, Barnabas is an Aramaic word that means literally son of consolation. That was the nickname. In modern English terms, you would say, he was someone who was an encourager. That was a son of consolation. That's what it meant. Someone who was good at encouraging and helping others. Encouraging and consoling and building up others. Now, you think about it. Here was a man who so exemplified this characteristic of being able to help others and to encourage them, that the apostles gave him a nickname, and everybody called him by that afterward. That was what he was known as. His nickname was based on what he said and the kind of things that came out of his mouth. He was just so noted for that and was such an outstanding example in that way that he became known by that nickname. There are other nicknames given in the Bible. James and John, the two brothers among the 12. Jesus gave them a nickname. He didn't call them Barnabas. That wasn't the nickname. He called them Boanerges, which meant literally translated sons of thunder. You could always hear that rumble in the background, and every so often the lightning flashed. When you meet James and John in the Gospels, they're coming from Galilee to Jerusalem, and they've got to travel through Samaria, and they stop off in this little village to buy food. And the Samaritans, who are very prejudiced against the Jews, don't like them. They realized they were on their way to Jerusalem. They said, "We're not selling you anything. We're not going to sell you any food. Get out of here." James and John were so furious. John said to Jesus, he said, "Lord, you want us let's just call fire down from heaven. You want us to just call fire down from heaven? We'll just burn the whole place up. Just nuke them. Just leave this black crater there." Jesus shook his head and he said, "What spirit are you of?" Well, that was their attitude. Boy, that made them mad. What do those guys think they're doing? They're not going to sell me any food. I'll get them. Well, if he had the power, he'd have just called it down and that would have been it. A little later, John came up to Jesus and he said, "You know what? We saw a fellow over there and he was casting out demons in your name." I went over there and told him to stop. I told him he couldn't do that, and I didn't want to hear about him doing that anymore. He better quit that. He wasn't with us, and I told him to quit. Jesus said, who told you to go over there and do that? Remember James and John, they were a little on the pushy side. They got their mother to
come to Jesus and say, Lord, I've got a request for you, like my boys, sort of. One of them sit on your right hand, the other sit on your left hand in the kingdom. When the other disciples heard about it, they were mad. The reason they were so mad was because that was what they wanted, see. But James and John were just sort of noted for being pushy. Jesus gave them a nickname. He said, you guys are sons of thunder. You're always, rumbling and, every so often the lightning flashes. Now, that goes to show, you see, that a person can fundamentally, deeply change. Because that's what we're introduced to John as a young man when Jesus was training him. But see, Jesus looked into him and he saw something that went beyond that. Because by the time you read of John in his latter years and you read the Gospel of John and you read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, you read about a man who wrote on the subject of love more completely and more fully than anybody else in the Bible. You go through and you read 1 John and all of the things that he's talking about, love and the love of God and loving one another and loving your brethren. And when you look at the things that he remembered. So all the disciples had heard what Jesus said there on that final Passover. But John is the one that it really, over and over, and as the years went by, probably more deeply, he thought about and he pondered and he remembered. And so you go through and read John 13 and 14 and 15 and 16, all the things that John recorded of Jesus' words and how much of it had to do with love. You see, John made some fundamental changes in his whole thinking and approach. And I dare say what came out of John's mouth was reflective of the changes that took place in John's heart as the years went by. You ever thought about it? We look at Barnabas and his nickname, and the apostles gave him a nickname and stuff. What kind of shape would you and I be in if somebody gave us all nicknames based on what we said, on the kind of things we said? What would be our nickname, And you could be stuck, see, if somebody's writing the book of Acts, from now on, you're not going to be referred to by your real name. You're going to be called by your nickname in the rest of the book. And so everybody in the Bible, everybody that ever reads the Bible, they get to read about you. But they get to read about you characterized by the nickname that you've been given. Some of us probably just as soon... it's something to think about. God's ultimately going to give us a new name, isn't He? And God names things what they are. When God changed people's names, it was to reflect a change in them. But what it ought to do, you see, as it expresses here in Romans 14, we want to follow after the things which make for peace and the things wherewith one may edify others. One may edify, to build up another. That's the opposite of things to put down another. In our society, there's so much in the way of put down humor. And it just, some of it can really cut, and somebody who's quick-witted, they come with a real zinger, and that's just a real put down. Everybody stands around, they sort of snicker and laugh, and, he really got you. Well, that's not the kind of thing that is constructive. What we're told here is things that build up, that edify. And in 1 Corinthians 8, verse 1, Paul says, "Now knowledge puffs up, but love builds up." Love edifies. So edifying, speaking in the kinds of things that edify, that build up one another, is going to come from a heart filled with love. What we say is very important. There are people who can go around and make all sorts of disparaging references and comments and put downs, and it can be very detrimental. And we've all heard those things. I remember back as a kid growing up, we had My dad had a little country grocery store, and sometimes in the evenings, certain times of the week or certain times of the month, very little going on there in the evening, and we would have we had a couple of neighbors that every so often would come by when things were not much was happening. They would come by and sit and talk. And my brother and I were fascinated by these two folks, Malvin and Ethel. We were fascinated by them for a couple of reasons, particularly fascinated by her. We were little kids, and we were really impressed with her aim because she dipped snuff. And she had tremendous aim. She just hit the can every time, And so we were pretty impressed with that. You got to be little to be impressed with something like that. We were impressed with that. And we'd never seen anybody do that way before, see, and so we were impressed with that. But the thing that really impressed us the most, even more than her ability, because actually everything that impressed us revolved around her mouth. See, one was the way she could spit the snuff, but the other was the way she talked. Because we'd never heard people, we'd never heard husbands and wives talk that way before. Poor old Malvin, he was sort of a meek, quiet fella. And I don't know if the poor man ever got to finish a complete sentence in his life. He never finished one in my hearing if she was anywhere around, because she would always interject, cut him off, and just, sort of steamroll over him. And he would sort of shrink back, sort of shrivel up a little bit. And she was it was just amazing to us because we'd never heard her parents talk to each other that way, and we knew they'd wear us out if we talked to one another that way. And you think about that. Now, I don't know that I've ever met anybody quite as outstanding in that regard as the two of them, but I've known some folks that have come close seconds over the years. The things they would say to one another. And if you say something, you can go back and apologize, but you can never unsay it. And if you say something that humiliates someone in front of others, you say something that puts someone down or just makes them a laughing stock in front of others, or that just, maybe they're not anybody else around, you just say it to them, but it cuts and it somehow belittles and hurts. You can later come back and say, oh man, I didn't mean that. But it doesn't do away with it, does it? We can't unsay what we say. It's really vital that we give thought to that. And we think that the things that are important to say are the things that edify, that build up, that encourage, things that are respectful and helpful, not the kinds of things that are hurtful and contrary. Paul explains in Ephesians 4, verse 29, he said, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers." Corrupt communication means dirty, rotten speech. It's the word this term corrupt, that's the term that would be used to describe garbage that's been sitting out somewhere. It's rank, it stinks, it's festering out there. Well, there's communication that can come out. There are words that can be rank, foul, stinking. Let none of these stinking words come out of your mouth. But that which is good to the use of edifying, of building up, of helping, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. Something that is given graciously, that is given freely, that it may come across in that it is given to those, whatever we speak is given to those around us, that it may minister grace to the hearers. It's something that is pleasant, it's gracious, it has that gracious quality. It builds up the person to whom it is directed, and it is something that is of a gracious quality for those who are around. And that Paul tells us in Colossians 4:6, "Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man." Now, salt, in our modern society, we think of salt as just a flavoring agent. And salt does add flavor, enhances flavor. But the primary purpose of salt in ancient times, and really not even that ancient times, the primary purpose of salt up until modern refrigeration salt was a preservative. You know, some of you probably grew up on the farm, remember the time when salt meat was, why was it salted? Well, it was used as a preservative. Now, that was why salt was such a valuable commodity in biblical times, because it was a necessity in terms of salt kills bacteria. That's why it's a preservative. It's a purifying agent. You can put salt on a wound, and bacteria can't grow in the presence of salt. So that's why that's why they tell you if you've got a sore throat, gargle with salt water. Well, what's the purpose of that? Well, salt kills the bacteria. Salty environment is deadly to most kinds of bacteria. So it was a preservative agent. So that's the sense Paul is using it here when he says, "Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt." That it has a permanent, enduring quality. There's something lasting about it. Let it be with grace, something that has that gracious quality. Let it be lasting, permanent. Let it be something of value, something that is gracious and enduring. Now, how do we go about doing that? Let's look a little further here in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is loaded with admonitions, and we'll look at just a few of them here in the closing part of the sermon. Proverbs chapter 15. Proverbs 15, in verse 23, it says, "A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season. How good is it?" A word spoken in due season. Saying things at the right time. Sometimes it's not just a matter of what you say, it's a matter of when you say it. There may be something that needs to be said to someone. But should it be said to them in front of a whole bunch of people, or should you have an opportunity to get them off privately, just the two of you, by yourselves, and to say it there? See, a word spoken in due season. That's a real knack. Learning how to say things at the right time. Picking your time. Now, one of the keys to saying things in due season is you don't just say the first thing that pops into your mouth. Just pops in, then it pops out. Well, what we discover when we say the first thing that pops into our head and that pops out of our mouth, what we find is that we've still got quite a bit of carnality left, because usually the first thing that pops in and out is something that we have cause to regret a little bit later. And I think, I wish I hadn't said that. Now, part of the key on that is the word spoken in due season. Instead of just saying the first thing that pops into your mind and letting it pop out of your mouth, you have to be like David, who asked God, "Set a watch at my mouth, set a guard. Post armed guards at my mouth. Don't let anything get out." Stop and think about it. Stop and think about it. That's the real key. And select, if it is the appropriate thing to say, then select the right time to say it. A word spoken in due season. Word spoken at the right time. And, there are so many things, like it mentions here in Proverbs 15 up in verse 18. It says, "A wrathful man stirs up strife, but he that is slow to anger appeases strife." Your temper just flares up and you just pop out with whatever comes into your mind. The chances are whatever the disagreement is going to get worse. If we stop and we think about it and we choose our words carefully and wisely, then one key is that it is spoken in due season. Now, another aspect of it, Proverbs 25:11, says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver." It's beautifully set off. So one aspect is saying it at the right time. Another aspect is saying it in the right way. a right choice of words. Learning how to choose our timing and also to choose our words. Thinking about it, of what really expresses our thoughts. Giving some time and attention to something. Because when words are well chosen, they're set off. It's described like apples of gold and pictures of silver. Beautiful frame and beautiful gold and silver, one setting off the other. Proverbs 10:19 gives us another key in this regard. It tells us, in the multitude of words, there wants not sin. He that refrains his lips is wise. Sometimes the best thing to say is nothing. That's sometimes the smartest thing you can say. Just refrain your lips. See, we're told up here a little bit earlier in verse 18, he that hides hatred with lying lips, he that utters a slander is a fool. In a multitude of words there wants not sin. He that refrains his lips is wise. So that is that is an important key. Is just realizing that avoiding saying something, just keeping our mouth shut, can be very helpful and beneficial. If we talk too much, we're going to get ourselves in trouble. It tells us in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 20, see you a man that is hasty in his words, there's more hope of a fool than of him. Because if he's hasty in his words, that means he's just always, first thing, just popping out his mouth. And if he's going to be hasty in his words, if he's just going to be impulsive and not stop and think and make some choices, then inevitably he's going to get himself in trouble. He's going to cause hurt and damage by the things that he says. Proverbs 16:24 tells us, pleasant words are as a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. The right word at the right time is sweet. It's enjoyable. It's something that is pleasant at the moment, and it's something that yields benefit on in the future. See, honeycomb tastes good, and it's also very healthy and nutritious. That's a lot of benefits to honeycomb. Something particularly if it comes from a local area, be very, very beneficial. People can chew honeycomb with allergies or things like that, and it can give them relief, be very beneficial. It's a lot of enzymes and various things in there. So it's beneficial in the long term, and it's sweet and pleasant to the taste immediately. Pleasant words are that way. They not only make you feel good at the moment, but in the long term, they serve to build you up. They serve to build emotional health. What we say carries a lasting impact. And the messages that we communicate and convey to others carries a lasting impact. We have certainly a tremendous impact on our mates. Very strong, tremendous impact on our children. And we have an impact on one another. We have an impact on our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers. With everyone with whom we come in contact, we can serve to bring out the best, or we can serve to provoke the worst. Our words are very important. We live in a nation that has ceased to really express thanksgiving and appreciation. We don't really value the things that we have, and so we're not a thankful nation. We don't express thankfulness to God, that ought to be a major source of our focus and what we're saying. But as a nation, we don't do that. So often, appreciation isn't even expressed to other people and valued in the way that it should. And even with us who say, on the one hand, all of us would acknowledge the importance of thanking God and praising Him. And yet James says, it's an anomaly. We can't have something good, blessing God and cursing man, coming out of the same mouth. That's like bitter water and sweet coming out of the same fountain. How do you have that? You see, what we say is important. And what we say toward others can undermine the value of what we say toward God. We want to focus in understanding the importance of it. That what we say serves to build up, to help, to encourage. That there is a gracious quality. That we place value on developing our ability to help and to build up and to encourage others by the words that we say. Think about it. Choose things carefully. And most fundamentally, you see, we have to go to the heart of the matter. Because it's out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. The key to getting rid of unclean lips is asking God to create a clean heart in us, that we might have that cleanness of heart that will have the motive of expressing what is good and helpful. But it's not only a matter of motives. That's the crucial thing. But then it's a matter of learning how to choose the right words and say them in due season. And those aspects, those three things really go together to solve the problem of what we say. First and foremost is the heart. Second and thirdly is learning then to choose our words with care, that we might have that gracious quality in our speech, a word fitly spoken, and also avoiding the hasty word, rather speaking the words in due season. The right time, well-chosen phrases, motivated by a clean and pure heart, will enable us to be, along with Barnabas and any number of others, those who have used their words not only to praise God, but to help and to encourage and to build up one another.